Have you ever wondered if life would be better had we not developed these massive, complex societies with our over-reliance on technology? What if we just remained as hunter-gatherers, living in small groups? Would there be less strife and despair? The idea of the noble savage, a primitive, non-westernized person who lives a utopian life of peace, unaffected by plagues of civilization, is a misleading idea. We like to romanticize these early days of human evolution and society, but this is largely unwarranted. Life for any biological being in the natural world is a struggle. Life is suffering, a quote attributed to Buddhism, and biologically, this is almost always the case. Suffering is a fundamental aspect of reality and an inevitable experience. The story of the human species is no exception. While we justifiably celebrate the ingenuity of early humans, their art, their tools, and their migrations across the globe, there's another side to this tale. One far less romantic, yet no less important to understanding who we truly are. Imagine, if you will, a scorching savanna millions of years ago. A group of early humans moves cautiously through the open grasslands, their eyes scanning for predators. They are no longer safe in the trees, where their ancestors once lived. The shifting climate has driven them to adapt, to walk upright, terrestrially. But this new way of moving comes at a cost. Their exposed position leaves them vulnerable to lions and hyenas, and the relentless sun beats down on their unprotected skin. Bipedalism has opened up new opportunities for survival, but it has also exposed them to immense dangers. Those new dangers must then be accounted for with new adaptations. Adaptations are a species' response to suffering. In this video, we'll be looking at the struggles that our human ancestors experienced throughout prehistory and into the early stages of civilization. This includes conflict, humans turning on one another for resources, diseases ravaging their fragile communities, claiming the young and the old alike, and famine, struck without warning, leaving entire groups to wither away in the face of merciless environments. These were the darker chapters of human evolution. The battles fought not just against nature, but against each other, shaping us in ways both brutal and profound. For within this darkness lies the story of how hardship forged the resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity that defines us as a species today. To understand where we come from, we must not only celebrate our triumphs, but confront the struggles that made them possible. This is the dark side of human evolution. Scholars have long debated whether humans are inherently good or bad, whether society has tamed or worsened us from our original hunter-gatherer ways. I'm here to tell you that both are true. When you study anthropology, you see that humans are naturally capable of both peace and violence. You see that social organizations are a mechanism to increase interpersonal cooperation, but none have ever gone extended periods of time without some degree of conflict. In the modern world, we see this in the form of violent crime within a society. Armed robberies and tragic acts of domestic terrorism seem far too common at times. Wars between groups are arguably the most extreme example of the human capacity for violence. To truly understand how deep this unfortunate potential of ours is, we must take a look at our closest primate relatives. Chimpanzees and bonobos are the two primate species we are most closely related to. The three of us likely shared a common ancestor around 6 or 7 million years ago. At that point, the human lineage split off and branched into countless hominin species, while the common ancestor to chimps and bonobos persisted as is. They then split sometime around 2 million years ago. Because chimps and bonobos split after our departure, we are equally genetically related to both. This means we can study the behaviors of these species to make inferences about how early humans may have behaved. Chimps and bonobos are nearly identical physically, especially to the lay person. Where they differ dramatically is in their behavior. Simply put, chimpanzees tend to show more displays of aggression while bonobos opt for peace, often using sex to settle conflict. However, Richard Wrangham, a man who spent more time with these primates than almost anyone, adds some important nuance to the discussion in his book, The Goodness Paradox. He argues that there are two types of aggression, and that these species display them to different degrees. The first is reactive aggression. This is impulsive, emotionally charged violence, such as a heated fight or sudden outburst. Reactive aggression is typically seen in situations of immediate frustration or threat. The second is proactive aggression. This is calculated, premeditated violence, such as planning an attack or going to war. Proactive aggression is often used strategically to achieve specific goals, such as power or resources. Chimpanzees exhibit high levels of both reactive and proactive aggression. Anyone who's seen the popular docuseries Chimp Empire on Netflix will have laid witness to this. They participate in border patrols, where groups of males roam the edges of their territory and attack individuals from neighboring groups. These attacks are often premeditated, lethal, and strategic, aimed at eliminating rivals and expanding resources like food or mates. They are also prone to impulsive outbursts of violence in response to immediate threats or frustration. This reactive aggression can lead to severe fights within their groups, often over dominance or mating rights. Bonobos, on the other hand, are starkly different from chimpanzees in their aggression patterns. They are far less prone to sudden, impulsive, and reactive violence. Conflicts within bonobo groups are rare and usually diffused through behaviors like grooming or sexual interactions, which function as social bonding tools. Although bonobos exhibit some forms of proactive aggression, like competition for resources or territory, it is much less frequent and less lethal compared to chimpanzees. These behavioral differences between chimps and bonobos reflect two evolutionary strategies for managing aggression, and humans seem to occupy an intermediate position. Like bonobos, humans have developed mechanisms to suppress reactive aggression, allowing for cooperation and peaceful social living. This was likely facilitated by processes such as self-domestication, where highly aggressive individuals were ostracized or punished, reducing their reproductive success. Others, who were less aggressive and more cooperative, were favored and had greater reproductive success. Like chimpanzees, humans have retained proactive aggression. We've retained the capacity for strategic violence, evident in warfare, punishment, and even modern competition more broadly. Together, the combination of these traits may have conferred incredible evolutionary advantages to early humans as they diverged from their chimp and bonobo relatives. Looking further down the timeline of human evolution, cave sites associated with Homo neanderthalensis hold evidence of violence in relatively younger human species. The Neanderthals are often envisioned to be brutish and barbaric. This isn't entirely true because they engage in many of the social beauties that Homo sapiens always have, including art and music. That said, they were still no stranger to conflict. Cima de los Huesos, or the Pit of Bones, is a remarkable archaeological site located deep within the Atapuerca cave system in northern Spain. Dating back approximately 430,000 years, it contains the remains of at least 28 Neanderthal individuals, offering a rare glimpse into the lives of our Middle Pleistocene ancestors. The site is significant not only for its sheer number of fossils, but also for the insights it provides into the behaviors and social dynamics of early hominins. The remains were found at the bottom of a 13-meter shaft, suggesting they were intentionally deposited, which some researchers interpret as an early form of mortuary behavior. This hints at a potential awareness of death and the beginnings of symbolic thought. The evidence of violence here is striking. One of the skulls, known as Skull 17, bears two distinct fractures on the forehead that are consistent with blunt force trauma. These injuries likely resulted from deliberate blows, possibly indicating interpersonal violence or even the earliest evidence of homicide in the human fossil record. Other explanations for the fracture, such as fall damage, were ruled out by the researchers investigating this skull. They said, from their consistent size and shape, the CR-17 blunt force traumas clearly are not unintentional, but rather, they appear to have been produced by the use of a tool of standardized size and shape. They go on to say, This represents the earliest clear case of deliberate, lethal interpersonal aggression in the hominin fossil record, demonstrating that this is an ancient human behavior. Shanidar Cave, located many miles away in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, is one of the most significant archaeological sites shedding light on the lives of Neanderthals. Discovered in the mid-20th century, the site contains the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals who lived approximately 35 to 50,000 years ago. Among the most notable finds are skeletal remains that provide evidence of traumatic injuries, some of which were severe but healed, suggesting that Neanderthals may have cared for injured members of their group. Shanidar I, for example, was a male who suffered the loss of his right forearm, significant hearing loss, and a partially blind eye, yet lived long after sustaining these injuries. He's a testament to the social bonds and cooperation that likely existed in Neanderthal communities. Shanidar I shows no sign of interpersonal aggression. However, that isn't the case for one of his buddies. Shanidar III displays an injury that could have been caused by conflict. He has a rib puncture bearing evidence of a low-mass projectile point wound, potentially caused by violent altercations. Interestingly, these altercations may have been with a member of the Homo sapiens species, due to their geographic overlap at the time. Fast forward to between 14 and 18,000 years ago, at a time when Homo sapiens were the only hominins left on Earth, we begin to see archaeological evidence of violence at a larger scale. Jebel Sahaba, located near the Nile River in modern-day Sudan, is one of the earliest known archaeological sites to hold such evidence. The site contains a cemetery with the remains of over 60 individuals from the late Stone Age. What makes this site particularly significant is the high prevalence of traumatic injuries among the skeletons, many of which are consistent with violent conflict. Over 60% of the individuals show signs of healed or unhealed trauma, including embedded stone projectile points, fractured bones, and evidence of repeated strikes. The site provides insights into the challenges faced by humans living in a changing and competitive environment. At the time, the Nile River Valley was a crucial resource, particularly in an arid and unstable climate. This likely led to conflict between groups competing for access to food, water, and territory. The injuries at Jebel Sahaba are not only consistent with combat, but also suggest a pattern of recurring violence, potentially indicative of prolonged hostilities or raids. The clustering of injuries, including on women and children, points to indiscriminate violence that affected entire communities rather than isolated skirmishes. It serves as a grim reminder that organized, group-based aggression has deep roots in our species' history, often shaped by environmental pressures and competition for survival. Remember, these individuals were still living in hunter-gatherer communities. Neither agriculture nor sedentary living were common yet. According to the researchers analyzing the cemetery, these were culturally distinct hunter-fisher-gatherer groups pressured into frequent conflict by perpetual environmental uncertainties. And with environmental uncertainty comes food scarcity. A major driver of evolutionary change is a species' ability to acquire the nutritional requirements for survival. Because food is a non-negotiable, small changes in the distribution of that food in the environment can result in big adaptations. So do we see evidence of food scarcity and famine in the evolutionary history of humanity? Let's take a look. But first, if you find this stuff interesting, make sure you go to the description and sign up for my free newsletter. Upon subscribing, you'll get a free archaeology cheat sheet, extra human evolution and archaeology content, and regular updates on all things in the Evolve Point 2 world. If you're a lover of the past, you won't regret it. So with that brief aside, let's get back into it. Throughout human history, few forces have shaped our evolution as profoundly as the search for food. The very act of eating, what, how, and when, has driven countless adaptations in our species. Yet, food has not always been abundant or easy to acquire. There have been times when droughts scorched the land, when game vanished from familiar hunting grounds, or when cold snaps turned fertile valleys into barren wastelands. For our ancestors, these periods of scarcity were a matter of life and death, forcing them to adapt or perish. But famine is more than just an absence of food. It's a crucible that tests the resilience of a species. From physiological changes like fat storage to ingenious innovations in food acquisition, the story of famine is deeply woven into our evolutionary fabric. What can we learn from the archaeological record, from the bones, tools, and landscapes left behind? And how did these struggles against scarcity ultimately shape the species we are today? Logically, one of the best ways to start answering these questions is by examining ancient teeth, the very tools we use to eat. Analyses of teeth can help determine the eating behaviors of people living long ago. We can begin with an example from one of our oldest ancestors, the Australopithecines. Australopithecines, our extinct cousins, lived between 4 and 2 million years ago. The group consists of about 8 different hominin species, including Australopithecus afarensis, or as you may know her, Lucy. These hominins provide a fascinating example of how evolution can shape anatomy in response to food scarcity. One of their most striking features is their large jaws and robust teeth, which are likely adaptations that allowed them to survive on fallback foods when their preferred resources became scarce. Primary food sources, like soft fruits or tender vegetation, may have been plentiful during certain seasons, but during periods of environmental fluctuation or drought, these options could disappear. In these changing times, Australopithecines likely turned to hard-to-process foods like nuts, seeds, and fibrous tubers to stay alive. By looking at the micro-wear patterns on teeth recovered from Australopithecine remains, some researchers find that their diets were rather diverse, including hard, brittle, and tough foods. Other micro-wear analyses have shown scant evidence of hard or tough foods eaten within the days before death. The authors of this latter study did offer a few explanations for this, one being that these hominins did occasionally consume extremely hard or tough foods, but did so sufficiently rarely that it was not picked up in the micro-wear of the 7 individuals sampled. This would suggest a model akin to the subsistence pattern of gorillas that prefer nutrient-rich soft foods but fall back on less desirable, more difficult to digest stems and leaves at crunch times. Aside from micro-wear analyses, these species were biomechanically designed for breaking down these tougher fallback foods. With their massive jaws and jaw muscles, it enabled them to extract vital calories when conditions were harsh. These adaptations didn't just help them survive lean times, they may have been critical to the long-term success of their lineage. By being able to exploit a wide variety of food resources, Australopithecines demonstrated a flexibility that would become a hallmark of later human evolution. This ability to pivot during periods of scarcity laid the groundwork for a species' remarkable dietary adaptability. But the important point here is that it wasn't necessarily a matter of how often tough times occurred. It was more so a matter of who survived when they did occur and why. In addition to the shape, size, and wear of our teeth, there are certain markers or deformities that teeth and bones produce under times of stress. For example, enamel hypoplasias refer to defects in the enamel of teeth that occur when enamel formation is disrupted during childhood, typically due to malnutrition, disease, or other physiological stress. These defects appear as grooves, pits, or thin enamel bands on teeth and are permanent markers of stress during the period when the teeth were developing. Enamel forms in distinct layers during early childhood, but if a child experiences significant stress such as malnutrition or vitamin deficiencies, especially calcium or vitamin D, enamel production can slow or stop temporarily. Once the stressor subsides, growth resumes, leaving behind visible lines or grooves that mark the period of interruption. In archaeological contexts, enamel hypoplasia is an invaluable tool for understanding health and nutrition in prehistoric populations. Because enamel does not remodel once it is formed, these defects remain on the teeth for life and can provide a record of early childhood hardships. The presence, frequency, and severity of enamel hypoplasia in skeletal remains allow researchers to identify periods of stress, including famine or resource scarcity, as well as broader patterns of environmental and social challenges faced by past human populations. A study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology examined enamel hypoplasias in a population of pre-contact Native Americans. The sample of 127 skeletons was recovered from an archaeological site in the lower Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley of Central California. some of which dated as far back as 2500 BC. They found 200 cases of teeth with hypoplastic lines. They also tested the proportion of Harris lines. Harris lines are horizontal lines that appear on long bones such as femur or tibia and are visible through x-rays. They form during periods of physiological stress, particularly in childhood when growth is temporarily halted or slowed due to factors like malnutrition. Once the stressor subsides, normal bone growth resumes, often leaving behind a visible scar in the bone that marks where growth was interrupted. Similar to hypoplasias, these lines are also associated with things like undernourishment, because when the body is deprived of adequate nutrition, particularly the proteins, vitamins, and minerals necessary for growth, it prioritizes survival over those less essential functions like bone growth. The researchers found 118 cases of Harris lines in this sample of Native American skeletons. Considering that both conditions were relatively widespread within this population, it is not unreasonable to suggest that many of the individuals experienced undernourishment, especially during their developmental years. While these archaeological examples show that food scarcity certainly occurred throughout human evolution, was it as rampant as people think? In a review of the literature, Loren Cordain and colleagues showed that there is little evidence to support the claim that modern hunter-gatherers experience periodic starvation. A more recent study compared hunter-gatherers to agricultural groups and suggests that the former actually experience less frequent periods of starvation than the latter. To explain this paradox, the researchers of the study proposed that, although in good years agriculturists may reap far more calories per unit of land than hunter-gatherers, hunter-gatherers can and do move in times of drought or flood, something that agricultural populations are limited in doing. While hunter-gatherers may have faced periods of food scarcity, their mobility and diverse diets provided a buffer against prolonged starvation. Their flexible diets were an adaptation to scarcity. The real dark side emerged with the advent of agriculture. This shift, often celebrated as a revolutionary advancement in human history, came at a steep cost. Humans became tethered to the land, dependent on a few staple crops that were vulnerable to droughts, floods, pests, and disease. Unlike hunter-gatherers who could move to more resource-rich areas, early agriculturalists were trapped, unable to escape the consequences of a failed harvest. This reliance on agriculture not only increased the frequency of famine, but also magnified its impact. Entire communities could starve when crops failed. Moreover, archaeological evidence suggests that there was actually an increase in hypoplasias during the Holocene as we shifted to agricultural lifestyles due to lower nutritional quality. It is a stark reminder that what we often see as advancements in human evolution carried unforeseen costs, locking our ancestors into cycles of scarcity and fragility that hunter-gatherers were better equipped to avoid. For all the resilience of our ancient ancestors, they were not invincible. Long before the rise of cities and civilization, long before crowded villages and domesticated animals, early humans faced enemies that were invisible to the eye. Disease and illness were lurking in the water, in the animals they hunted, and even in their own bodies. These afflictions were not just the result of harsh environments, but often stemmed from the very activities that allowed our species to survive: hunting, gathering, and moving through new and unpredictable landscapes. Both infectious and non-communicable diseases have put immense selective pressures on the human lineage. The coevolutionary arms race between humans and microbial disease is ancient. It's believed that the hominin lineage has been co-evolving with the ancestors of contemporary pathogens, including hepatitis B, measles, HIV, KSHV, HPV, malaria, the plague, and smallpox, since as far back as 7 million years ago. To put this in perspective, this is around the time when early hominins split from chimps and bonobos. As we migrated out of Africa and explored new lands, we entered novel ecologies with pathogens and parasites we were not yet immune to. This graph shows the emergence of various infectious diseases in relation to key migrations and events in human history. Natural selection favored those who could fend off these diseases. Those who could not perished. Unraveling the effects of diseases on ancient hominins is no easy task. That being said, research on modern-day hunter-gatherers can serve as an analog of what this early association may have looked like. Though the circumstances are not completely identical, the hunter-gatherers of today are the most comparable examples of what life was like during our African origins. It has been shown that up to 60% of contemporary hunter-gatherers who die before the age of reproduction succumb to disease. Of the more than 1,400 infectious organisms that cause pathogenic disease in humans, the majority of them are invisible to the naked eye. That said, the imperceptible nature of pathogens has been made visible by archaeological research that supports the presence of infectious diseases in Pleistocene-aged people. One example comes from Siberia, where archaeologists unearthed 32,000-year-old milk teeth, or baby teeth, that contained the genetic material from human adenovirus and variants of herpes. Siberia during the Pleistocene is far from the ideal environment for a virus. If infectious diseases could persist here, we can be certain they were present in the warmer and more humid environments of the tropics. Although diseases surely had an impact on hunter-gatherer societies, their populations were not of sufficient size to sustain large-scale epidemics or pandemics. Once humans began to practice agriculture, populations grew and became denser in settled locations, thus providing the pathogens a launch pad for takeoff. It was at this point, around 12,000 years ago, that plant domestication and animal husbandry would reshape the human-pathogen relationship. Many of the most prominent diseases that affect humans can be linked to living in close proximity to animals like cattle, pigs, and dogs. These zoonotic diseases are transmitted from animals to humans either directly or through vectors like insects. Anthropologists have been able to study the deformations on human bones often caused by staph bacteria. They have found an increase in these deformations, known as periosteel reactions, on skeletons associated with the Holocene compared to skeletons dating prior to agriculture. According to anthropologist Clark Larson, the development of tuberculosis also mimicked this pattern of increased frequency in the post-hunter-gatherer world. Paleoanthropologist Daniel Lieberman says, almost every major infectious epidemic, such as smallpox, polio, and the plague, happened after the agricultural revolution began. To explore the severity of some of these diseases, let's consider their death tolls. The plague of Athens struck the city during the Peloponnesian War in 430 BC, killing an estimated 75 to 100,000 people, about 25% of the population, over several outbreaks spanning 4.5 to 5 years. Thucydides' detailed account describes symptoms like rash, high fever, and diarrhea, suggesting smallpox or typhus, though modern analyses using forensic and epidemiological methods continue to debate the exact cause. The Justinian plague of the 6th century is estimated to have killed between 15 and 100 million people, or 25 to 60% of the late Roman Empire's population. Its impact was so severe that many scholars consider it one of the factors that led to the fall of the Roman Empire. Recent research has suggested that these might be slight over-exaggerations. However, there is no doubt that this same plague-causing bacterium, Yersinia pestis, wreaked havoc on the planet many years later. Yersinia pestis re-emerged as the commonly known Black Death between 1347 and 1351. It spread rapidly via fleas on rats and human trade routes, leading to widespread societal collapse, economic instability, and a significant reshaping of European demographics. The pandemic not only decimated urban centers, but also affected rural areas, creating labor shortages that disrupted feudal systems and contributed to social and economic transformations. Its death toll is estimated at about 50 million, or up to 70% of some European cities. Despite its devastating toll, the Black Death is credited with promoting innovation in medicine, public health, and labor practices. What gets even darker is when you begin to think about the mechanisms by which many of these diseases perpetuate. They thrive on human connection. What do I mean by this? I mean that one of the key aspects of being a human, being tied to a close-knit cultural group, is what allows these diseases to survive and spread from host to host. Without humans building strong connections and living in close proximity, they'd have no no host to leech off of. This is largely why the big sedentary societies that emerged from agriculture promoted the spread of pathogens. Eventually, populations did develop immunities, but that wouldn't eliminate the threat. Often the burden was simply offset to another population who was not yet immune. This is precisely what happened to the indigenous people of the Americas. From 1518 to 1618, the population of Mexico declined from 20 million to 1.4 million, largely due to consecutive epidemics brought by the Europeans. Unfortunately, the Aboriginal Australians and many other groups around the globe experienced a similar fate. With the countless number of times that prehistoric groups were migrating and coming into contact with unfamiliar groups, who knows how many times this story played out throughout human evolution. Between violence, intermittent bouts of food scarcity, and lethal disease, humans have experienced their fair share of hardships. These were the darker moments of our evolution. But on the other hand, human evolution is responsible for the development of great innovation. Arguably, the pinnacle of prehistoric technological innovation comes from the Americas and is attributable to the Clovis culture. Check out the video on the screen to explore the tools these people developed and their fascinating ways of life. It's a much brighter story than the one told in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.